Good afternoon. We're so thrilled to have you here in this incredible energy of this room. We're really excited about that. I'm Carrie Booth-Walling. I'm the director of the Human Rights Program here in the College of Liberal Arts. Thank you for joining us for what we think is a timely and important conversation about Minnesota's rich yet complicated human rights history. Complicated because while Minnesota advocates and organizations have made valuable contributions to the global human rights movement, Minnesota is also a site of past and continuing human rights violations. This space that we occupy today is a reminder of that contradiction. As I welcome you to this beautiful Andersen Library and exhibition space and the university, I acknowledge that our campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Minnesota Makoche, homelands of the Dakota Iote indigenous people. We have assembled an incredible panel of local human rights experts to help us examine these successes, failures, and the continuing challenges as we struggle against torture, for women's rights, and for racial justice. Today's panel is sponsored by the University of Minnesota Libraries, Archives and Special Collections, the Human Rights Program, and the Roy Wilkins Center for Human Relations and Social Justice. We're also extremely grateful for the financial support of the Imagine Fund Special Events Grant, which is an initiative of the University of Minnesota Executive Vice President and Provost, established with a generous gift from the McKnight Foundation and facilitated by the Institute for Advanced Study. We also want to thank the many people whose intellectual and physical labor, financial support, and design talent have made the panel, the archive, and the exhibition possible. And this includes an entire team of researchers, contributors, editors, curators, designers, and funders, and this is made up of graduate students, undergraduate students, faculty, and staff. And many of these folks have been working together across multiple years to get us to this point of celebration today. And so I just want to pause for a moment to invite those of you who are here who have participated in this project, the panel, exhibition, and today's events, to go ahead and please stand or at least wave your hand so that we can recognize you. Thank you. And I especially want to note the specific contributions of the executive team and the vision from Barb Fry, the team including Patrick Finnegan, Rochelle Hammer, Meyer Weinschall, Chris Kiesling, Eric Moore, Linnea Anderson. And so we want to thank all of them for their special contributions. And now it's my pleasure. I'm going to invite Dr. Ann Meyer, who's our Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Programs, to share a brief greeting. So thank you, Ann.
Thanks, Carrie. Thank you guys all for being here. As Carrie said, my name is Ann Meyer, and I'm Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Programs in the College of Liberal Arts. And the College of Liberal Arts shares the Masters in Human Rights program with the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. So on behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and our Dean, Ann Waltner, who's home caring for a sick family member today, I want to thank you all for coming, and I especially want to echo Carrie in thanking the curators, the designer, contributors, and narrators of the human rights stories that we'll hear today and into the future. Thanks to this archive and exhibit that I'm very excited to see the exhibit later today. When I read through the narrative materials for today, as a representative of the university and as a sociologist, is my home discipline, but especially as a Minnesotan, I felt a lot of pride for our state, and also a lot of motivation to push past the paradox that my public affairs colleague, Dr. Sam Myers back there, so eloquently identified, that Minnesota ranks highest among the U.S. States on so many indicators of well-being, but yet we are the worst in terms of some of the disparities that we evidence here in terms of well-being for our citizens. So the paradox, I think, calls us to be our better selves, and we, as we'll see today and in the exhibit and the archive, that the work that these human rights luminaries up here have done toward that end has really lifted us all. And in getting our house in order here in Minnesota, we can share lessons learned with those locally and globally and call on them to hold us accountable at home as well. So I'm excited to hear more about that work now, and I'm going to turn it over to Barb.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Just checking to see if this is working. Yeah? Okay, good. Raise your hand if you can't hear me, whenever. So I'm so delighted to be here. This has been in our imaginations for the past several years, and when I finally got to come and see the panels upstairs hanging there, it's a kind of a surreal experience. So I invite you all, if you haven't done it yet, after this program, please go up to the second floor and take a tour of the panels that tell the story in headlines, really, of Minnesota's human rights stories, and the idea behind the exhibition is the global reach of local activism. I'm delighted to be joined here today by this amazing panel when we thought, okay, who could we have come and talk a little bit about the stories behind the stories in this exhibition. We couldn't have asked for a more wonderful representation of voices. And so with me are experts on the three issues that are covered in this first exhibition of the Minnesota Human Rights Archives. Those are the history of activism in Minnesota on the issue of torture. And so with me is Emily Hutchinson, who is the Vice President for Global Programs at the Center for Victims of Torture, and formerly directed the New Tactics in Human Rights Project, which has been such an important part of the CVT's advocacy programs, and a lot of intersection with the University of Minnesota's teaching in the Masters of Human Rights program. And anyone who's ever had a class with me has learned about the New Tactics Project. So Emily, thank you. Representing issues regarding activism on issues of racial justice is Angela Rose Myers, who we are so proud of, a graduate of our Masters of Human Rights program in 2023. Angela Rose was the youngest director, or youngest, what were you, president of the Minneapolis NAACP, and has been a steady presence and voice in the racial justice movement in Minnesota for pretty much as long as she's been alive, from what I can tell. We brought Angela Rose back from Miami, where she is at the University of Miami in her first year of law school. She's decided to go the joint path of law and human rights, and so it's been wonderful to have her back. So thank you, Angela Rose. And our third speaker is Loretta Frederick, who is here to give us, being herself a person who lived through this entire arc of activism on violence against women, starting in Minnesota, and especially focused on domestic violence. Loretta was formerly the Senior Legal and Policy Advisor of the Battered Women's Justice Program, but that's just sort of the title. She's kind of everyone's expert, has done amazing work with the Advocates for Human Rights, with Global Rights for Women, all throughout her career, as well as working on the issue in the state of Minnesota. So we're just so pleased and touched that you could be here, Loretta. Thanks. So I want to frame this panel a little bit. You know, those of us who work in the field, and there's a lot of us in this room, it's kind of scary. Somebody could yeah, do some damage in the human rights community right now. We're kind of used to the frequently asked question, why Minnesota? What is it about Minnesota? Why are they so engaged in international work? And it's really our hope that this particular exhibition goes towards beginning to answer that question. And I can go on and on about, and we could probably have a lovely conversation among ourselves why we think it's Minnesota, but putting together this story where we've selected these 3 issues that we felt that we had adequate collections and we had adequate experience to be able to tell these 3 stories well, that you begin to see some things emerge, right? You see the leadership. You see individuals who've played these incredibly important roles in going the extra mile. We see a collaborative environment where people are used to working together in collaboration, and that goes beyond Minnesota's borders, and we begin to build these really profound networks across borders. And the other thing that really struck me is institutional stability. So you'll see a lot of references, for instance, to the Center for Victims of Torture, the Advocates for Human Rights, 2 organizations that are 40 years old. And you think, there's just so much history and so much expertise that gets built up in these communities, and of course, dozens of other organizations that are doing similar work. And one of the really important things is the investment in those organizations, the organizational leadership, the ability to attract talented people, and that has made a really big impact. So those are my thoughts on that issue, but I'd like to frame this discussion first by asking our panelists, I think we'll do it more as a conversation, and so let me throw out a first framing question, and you can respond to that as you want. So if you would tell us what stories are told in this exhibition, and are they important stories to tell for future researchers, for the students, and for the public? So, what stories are told, and maybe what stories aren't told, and how are they told? So, Loretta, I see you're holding that microphone. Would you like to start?
Way to go. Okay, so I think I'm going to start by talking about why I think these stories have utility. Because this would be the answer to, I would describe almost every one of the things that your material is describing would be subject to these same considerations. I think that Minnesota, for maybe the reasons that you raised earlier, has been served as a laboratory, from what I could see, of a lot of very creative thinking and practicing and trying stuff out and practicing and trying stuff out. And that the practices and the approaches and stuff that, at least in my field, have evolved in part from work here, those practices got started because a group of, in my case, primarily women, but not exclusively, said, this is ridiculous. We have to do something about this. And people like Sharon Vaughn said, women can come and hang out at my house, and that was the first shelter. And nobody thought, there was no such thing as a shelter network, you know what I mean? But she just said, well, this is ridiculous. And so she did that. And then similar things happened in Minneapolis. And Denise Gamache was one of the people who who started the second shelter. And, and people in the U.S. at that stage, in the 70s, were unable to communicate with each other in the way we can. And so people would call people up on the phone and say, you know what we're doing here? And because we were practicing these things, trying these things out, and it was complicated, even a shelter, right? I mean, so do you have rules in the shelter? Who gets to decide who comes into the shelter? Can you bring your 18-year-old son with you? Or is that a problem? Do you have to do work if you're living there? Or, you know what I mean? So you can just imagine the range of questions to be answered just if you want to just have a shelter for 5 minutes. So practices got started, and people tried them out, and people changed their minds. And there were a lot of fights. Well, not fights, but you know what I mean. You had to be rethinking all the freaking time. And the other, so that's one reason, I think, because we served as a laboratory for a bunch of stuff over time. And the other thing, I think, in my field, the reason I think a lot of the stuff that we started doing here had some traction is that we were pretty good at designing stuff based on what the lived experiences of battered women were. We weren't coming at it. Like when we first started doing work in former Soviet countries, they were all like, the mental health people are deciding what's a good practice and what's good for women and, what their mental health problems were. And we were going, no. It's not about the ladies being crazy. I mean, that's kind of overstating the dichotomy, but so that's my impression, is that it was those two things, the grounding in the lived experiences of the people whose lives we were trying to impact, and the fact that we just started trying stuff out and then telling people and then changing our minds and trying stuff out. And as of a year ago, we would say to people all over the world, when they would say, well, what are you saying we should do that because you said different 5 years ago? And we would have to say all the time, we are reinventing this thing every day, because stopping violence against women in intimate relationships and other forms of violence against women is an intractable, patriarchy-based, intersectional, problem that is just too hard to address if you don't keep thinking all the time about what you're doing wrong. So anyway.
That's great. That's great. Angela Rose, would you like to go next?
Yes.
What are the stories we're telling?
Yes. I mean, so if you go upstairs to the fantastic exhibit, you'll see a little bit of, the institutional story of the Roy Wilkins Center, and the Roy Wilkins Center is part of my life, right? So it was very interesting to see the history of the world conferences on racial and ethnic economic inequality. And when you're there, I think right now particularly, I grew up in a time where, okay, I'm 28. Okay, I don't know. Sometimes I get younger, sometimes I get even younger than that. So I grew up in a time where Trayvon Martin, if he were to be alive, he would be my age, right? When Trayvon Martin was murdered, I was the same age as him. When, I saw all of these black men and then also black women with Sandra Bland being murdered by the police, I come from a background where my parents are professors. I'm very privileged in that way of having a foot always in academia, having a foot in the community. And when George Floyd was murdered, I was just out of college. I was working with the NAACP. We were kind of just going around trying things. It was an era when we had 3 very young, strong Black women who were the head of the Minneapolis NAACP. Leslie Redmond was the president. Anika Bowie was the vice president. That was the second vice president. And Anika Bowie is now a city councilwoman over in St. Paul. Leslie Redmond is still in Minnesota doing amazing work. And so, it was a moment in time where I was trying to figure out, okay, I have all of this knowledge. And Leslie, she would always be like, you have all of this knowledge about civil rights history, about, what's going on, these studies about disparities and racial disparities in Minnesota. And then I was also in these rooms where I didn't have to use large academic theories and words, but I could see that the community members that I was face to face with were living, these theories. They were living the policy, that I had spent time at Barnard studying, right? And I was like, how can we work through getting the policy and the lived experience to where the lived experience isn't at the detriment of the policy, right? Where people aren't living through bad policy decisions. And then when you go to elected officials and you say, I'm living through a bad policy decision, they internalize that and they take it and do some action. So I was trying to figure out these tools, right? Like how can you figure this out? And I realized even looking at my own family, looking at the Roy Wilkins Center, looking at the work that the University of Minnesota has done, that there's a path set out here, right? There is work here that is longer than just my lifetime, but decades of work where a lot of scholars, activists, community folk have come together and tried to figure out what are the frameworks we're going to use for this change to actually impact people's lived experiences. How are we going to not just think through this so we can have a nice paper and it'll be in a very good journal, right? And the most prestigious journal, but actually think through this in a way where the folks who are our research subjects are really not just that. They're human beings who live through this. And so I really enjoy the human rights framework because of that. Because of this idea of there's an obligation from the state. There's an obligation that we all have collectively to ensure the human rights of everyone. And that's so deeply entrenched, I think, in the culture of Minnesota and the culture of the human rights work here, and kind of just tangoing with that through the academic and practical lens is something that I see in the stories that are upstairs.
Thank you. You still have your microphone? You do. Great. I think it will. It's the bottom, right?
Into mine.
Okay.
See if that works.
Technology. Is this working? Okay. Okay. It is or is not? I'm getting both.
Okay.
I have a pretty loud voice, so even if it doesn't work, hopefully it can carry. I think what you both said really resonates with me with respect to CVT in a couple of different ways. I think, the point you were making about it's important to tell these stories because they're great examples of people who recognized a problem and tried to do something about it. Emphasis on do something, not write about it, not theorize about it, do something about it. And I think, in CVT's case, the way that began was providing direct services, mental health services to refugees and asylum seekers. And that's, really expanded over the years as we as an organization have learned how to be and do that better and expand that work. But I think we were the first in the United States, the first torture treatment center in the United States. So I think just that the very nature of being the first at something, it's an important example to provide because it, I think, allows people to learn from both our successes, but also what we didn't do well, what we're trying to do better. And I think that that's just so important. I think the other thing that's important is, to your point, Barb, is people are surprised that, you know, oh, why would Minnesota be at the forefront of this? And I guess the way I think about it is, I mean, I grew up here. No one told me I couldn't be. No one said, because you're from the Midwest, you obviously can and know nothing and do nothing about human rights. And I just think we have this attitude instilled in us, as you were talking about, of like, let's do something about these things. We have the skills, we have the talent, we have the innovation, we have the ideas, and we do. And I think that's just so critical. I think the other thing that really resonated with me as well was just talking about trying stuff, right, and adaptation. I mean, Nancy Pearson is here. She is the founder, the mother, the lifeblood of the New Tactics in Human Rights program at CVT, and that is completely focused on innovation and trying things and adjusting and recognizing that you might need to shift, you might need to change to reach the sort of human rights goal that you're aiming at. And I think that's just really an important message to share. It might not be perfect the first time, and you might make some mistakes, but that doesn't detract from the overall effort and the desire to get it right.
That's great. What a nice common theme. I mean, at the Advocates for Human Rights, we of course were in the same let's do something mode, even to the point of our great mentor and friend David Weisbrod, literally coming up with a list. It was like, the Martin Luther list on the door or something. It was like the 12 suggestions of David Weisbrod. And here is what you can work on. How about, coming up with a protocol or on how you do autopsies for the international community. And I do think it is interesting. There is sort of this can-do attitude of, well, we're willing to give it a try. So, and I think it's powerfully reflected in the early stories that are in these panels, for sure.
Say, can I add one more thing that occurred to me? I don't know if this is true of your movements as much, but so I'd be curious. I feel like one of the big things that supported the stuff that was happening is still happening in Minnesota on domestic violence related issues is the support that came from way back in the 70s from the legal aid organizations and legal activists. I mean, lawyers who were like, that's bad, and what can we do? And so, and when there was no legal remedy for the problem, people went to legislatures and said, well, hello, and the continued support, because like the first shelter was formed with the legal aid of Ramsey County women lawyers who were representing all these women who had nowhere to go, and they were like, well, yeah, let's. So and that's still the case, right? I just think that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean the nature of voluntarism in the community, and specifically in the Bar Association, is notable. And I've learned that from working in other countries and suggesting, well, why don't you get some pro bono lawyers to do this work? And they look at you like, what? People have a hard enough time making a living here. They don't think about doing free work for someone else. And I do, pro bono is something that is true throughout the United States, but I think there is particular value, at least in my era in the law practice, that was placed on this. I can't speak for now, but I think it still exists. So let's shift a little bit to the global focus here, if we could. Help us, if you would, to situate each of your issues in the global context. Where does this work that originated from Minnesota, what impact has it made globally? Are we just tooting our own horn here? Or from your experiences, are there, on the issues that you've worked on, do you see this, this global impact? And, maybe think of some stories. You've all, brought your work internationally on your issues, and, what kind of reactions do you get globally? And are we overstating our case to say Minnesota has an outsized impact in the international human rights community? Anyone want to start? Go
Sure.
ahead.
I think with the most recent, I guess, way Minnesota has been on the international platform is through when George Floyd was murdered, right? And when George Floyd was murdered, I was vice president of the Minneapolis NAACP. And when Daunte Wright was murdered a year later, I was president. And in both instances, there was such international attention, right, on Minnesota, on what is it about Minneapolis? What is it about Brooklyn Center where Daunte Wright was murdered? What is it about these places where people are dying? And now it's blown up, right? And I would just, unfortunately, there have been multiple murders since George Floyd was murdered. Unfortunately, even in Minnesota, there have been multiple murders with Tekle Sundberg, with Amir Locke, with Winston Smith. And, well, police-involved killings, right? And so what is it about that moment in time where there was such an emotional reaction to when George Floyd was calling out for his mother, when, you saw Derek Chauvin on his neck, that it caused international ripples? And then the focus back was, what is Minneapolis going to do? We have the same mayor now, is what it is. But it's one of those things where we see these small changes that are drastic, that are having major impacts. So right after George Floyd was murdered, all four of the officers, myself and a number of Black women, went to Chief Arredondo and we said, okay, they need to all be fired. So that wasn't a requirement. And you know that also that didn't happen with Kim Potter after Daunte Wright was murdered, right? There was no requirement for an officer to be fired if there's an incident or even suspended. So they were all fired immediately, not even a full 24 hours, 48 hours later. And then that seemed to cause a shock. People were like, oh, wow, this is something that we haven't seen. Something is happening here. You saw thousands, tens of thousands of people coming out onto the street during a global pandemic. And not only did you see the protests, which, I think everyone in the world saw, but we also saw that there were people who were setting up almost like stations, right? Like grocery store stations, right? They were setting up ways, okay, how can we get you home? How can we keep people safe? Okay, we're gonna have masks here. We're gonna have medics here. And an extreme fast organization that was able to sustain a lot of the protests and even sustains George Floyd Square today. And so, there was another focus again of like, wow, interesting. What's happening here? What's happening here? Then you saw, the city council up on a stage saying we're going to abolish the police. Now that sent shockwaves, right? That was wow. Minnesotans aren't afraid to stand up. And this was, on that stage was two trans Black folk, a Latina, and, another Black man, and a white woman, I think, was on the stage. And so, that's Minneapolis City Council, right, at that moment. It's like, wow, this is a side of Minnesota that, if you grew up on Golden Girls, you just think of, Rose from Golden Girls, and very sweet, but those sweet little old women were also there in the protests. Those sweet little old women were also out here and doing this type of work. So what does it mean to have a very multiracial, very progressive city and still a man was murdered by the police? So that was some of the contentions that internationally we had to deal with. on the way that I go to a lot of other places, I was just in Colombia, in Cartagena, talking to an anti-racist group there of Black women. And when I was talking about the police, it was very interesting because the way policing shows up in Colombia is heavily informed of how the Colombian police were trained by American police, right? So it's international in the sense of, when my friend came from Colombia to the US, she was like, I didn't realize it was like this. But then you see the mirrors of hyper-policing across the world as well, and this racial policing across the world. So there's a lot of focus here on what can we do to end, racially motivated murders by the state. But we can't stop in the sense of saying, okay, once we figured it out, that's gonna be good. Once we figured it out here, we have to deal with the ramifications that this has been amplified and essentially exported across the world.
Emily, where does Minnesota fit in the global stage in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think so I want to sort of take it in two separate parts. One is the torture treatment movement sort of specifically, and then I think the human rights movement more broadly. And I think in the torture treatment movement, Minnesota really is front and center in the global fight against torture and in the global effort to treat victims of torture and other gross human rights violations. So, we started 40 years ago as a small organization based here in the Twin Cities, serving refugees and asylum seekers who had made their way to the Twin Cities area. And today we operate in 5 different countries and touch the lives of over 200,000 survivors of torture and their families every year. So we have become really a global organization and been able to not only work directly with torture survivors in other countries, but also support other torture treatment centers like CVT that have actually been established in other countries so that movement spreads, right? Not just the treatment piece, but also I think the advocacy piece. CVT was an important part of advocating for passage or ratification, of the Convention Against Torture in the U.S. and we continue to advocate for increased U.S. contributions to the UN fund for victims of torture, the UN Voluntary Fund, so that we are expanding the resources available to organizations who are working to treat torture and to end torture. So I think that is an important place for us to be. And I do think we have had a significant impact on that. And I guess a specific example I would give would be, in a couple of places globally where we've opened clinics, there really wasn't the expertise in mental health, torture treatment for mental health survivors, right? So people might have had a degree in mental health generally, but not a lot of specificity in terms of that training. Today, in most of our locations, we have almost no one who's not a national of the country in which we're operating who is delivering the services to clients. And I think that's really important, that we were able to support some of the education systems and certificate programs to even create the capacity to sustain, right, the work of organizations like CVT. So I think that's important. I think the other thing I have always found really interesting and really has resonated with me when I was part of the New Tactics in Human Rights program is just this, and CVT contributes to this. So I think just this concept of resilience as resistance. So I think globally, human rights activists are exhausted. They're burned out, they're traumatized. It's really hard to stay in this work. And, resilience is critical to being able to continue to fight and to make demands on our elected officials and to push for change. And so I think another contribution we've been able to make more recently is in supporting human rights activists in enhancing their own resilience so that they can continue to do so much of this important work that, you know, if they're out of the work, then we are down a wonderful, you know, person who is contributing to really important issues.
Loretta, talk to us about your experience globally and how you.
Oh, first of all, I feel like I should not be the one talking about this because my work has been in the global arena has been driven by the opportunities presented by all the organizations represented here who do that work. So thanks, y'all. And we have had an outsized. I do believe this is not, you know, a ridiculous statement to make. We have had an outsized effect on people outside Minnesota, outside the United States, on responding to domestic violence and violence against women, beginning with, actually I would say earliest would have been the work done in Duluth, Minnesota, when Ellen Pence and her colleagues and Michael Paymar and a bunch of other people started to try to engineer institutional responses to domestic violence, chiefly through the legal system. There is some misunderstanding out in the field about this, unfortunately, because it wasn't driven exclusively by an interest in penalizing perpetrators of domestic violence through the criminal legal system. It was in response to what battered women, I'm going to use that term, although it's gender-based violence victims of all kinds, but chiefly women. And women were very distressed at the fact that when they were being badly beaten and threatened and, you know, all kinds of terrible things, and their children involved and stuff like that, they would call for someone to interrupt and pull the person off them. And the people they would call would be law enforcement, and law enforcement wouldn't do anything because the law didn't even permit it. And then when the law did start to permit it, thanks to the activism, so Ellen Pence and her colleagues and stuff said, what can we do to provide the people who are using this violence, chiefly men, at least in heterosexual relationships, and how can we provide them an opportunity and encouragement to get their heads together, to understand that it doesn't advantage anybody to have control over the entire family through violence. And so they developed and sold to institutions in Duluth at the outset this idea that we could require somebody who's engaging in this behavior to sit down with other people who are engaging in this behavior, and through a facilitated conversation over time, learn a different way of thinking about their partners and their rights in their heads to control and manipulate and run the lives of their partners. And that was a big darn deal. And all over the world, people picked up on it. And institutionalized responses are one way of responding to this problem. Community, direct community, your family, your church, your, whatever. Those are other options. And they're harder to manipulate, I don't mean that in the negative sense, but to alter, anyways, because you can go to a legislature and make them change the law if you make enough noise. But taking up someone's entire faith community and trying to get them to engineered to support is a little harder. And so we're behind the 8 ball on that stuff. And but that's a whole other conversation.
Great. Well, I want to prompt us into a few stories behind the stories here. We're gonna what you see on the panels, the panel exhibition upstairs, is what I think of as headlines. You know, it's sort of a lot of the primary collections that we have that are accompanied by some very sparse description of what was going on there. But you know, there's so many people who aren't included on those panels. There's so many stories that aren't included on the panels. So I would like to prompt us, and I have some particular questions about this. Loretta, I'm going to start with you this time. You went to Beijing, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the panels, it really talks about the impact of the Beijing, the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you have any memories that you could share about that experience, and then about what kind of a shift it made in even our own work as a community in Minnesota.
Oh yeah. Yes, so in 1995, I was invited to join the Ms. Foundation delegation to the conference. And because I was a Minnesotan, I got invited by the Advocates for Human Rights to go and teach a workshop with them on domestic violence and responses. And one of the tools that we used was the power and control wheel, which many people I'm sure know about. It was developed by the people up in Duluth. A bunch of battered women sat around for a couple of years and brainstormed all the ways in which their abusers were controlling them. And so the kinds of tactics were being used. So we took this handout, among other things, when we were talking about our stuff that we're doing here. And these women, the entire time we were there, if I'm not mistaken, y'all, women were coming up to us and saying, exactly our lives. No matter what country they were from, they were saying, yep, that's the 8 categories of stuff that our men are doing to us. And the only difference between our version and their versions was the nature of the physical violence and the weapons being used. It's machetes, it's guns. It's knives, it's guns. It's, you know, and that was basically it. I mean, there was use, more extensive use of extended family members to exert control in some women's lives, and, you know, which is the same in the United States across cultures and communities and stuff. But it was amazing. We should have predicted this. It was so, and I have said that probably 1,000 times in my life to try to explain to people how ubiquitous and how functional the patriarchy is. So that's one thing that I thought was really interesting. And the other was, this was the first conference that had a meeting of women with disabilities from around the world. That it was like a couple of days before the NGO conference started, I think. So women with disabilities showed up together from around the globe for the first time ever, which was a big thing. To, again, with the intersectional nature of all these forms of oppression, it was an eye-opener for a lot of people. And unfortunately, the physical setup there in Wairo was just a joke, so it was kind of hard for anybody to get around, much less somebody with a mobility problem. But it was very interesting learning from other women from around the world about how different features of a woman's life, characteristics of her body, her religious and faith background, if any, how all these things could either entrap further or help liberate her, entrap further or help liberate her. And, yeah.
That's great. That's really helpful. Angela Rose, one of the panels that people will see upstairs is about these world conferences on racial and ethnic equality. Is that what they're called?
Remedies.
Remedies, okay. So, which Dr. Sam Myers, right there, in the back of the room, was the mastermind, continues to be the mastermind. This has been going on for decades. And including the Durban Conference, which was in South Africa in 2001, just before 9/11. So it sort of got washed away from collective memory, but was a very big controversial conference on race. LeJune, were you at Durban? Yeah, and Dr. Myers was at Durban. Anyone else? Yeah, okay, Christy was at Durban. So Angela Rose was not at Durban. She informed me she was a child. But you have worked on these conferences, and talk about like how phenomenal it is that we've been running these conferences out of Minnesota all around the world on these issues for like 40 years, 30 years. Okay, I won't overstate it.
Yes, and then we also have someone who was at the Brazil conference. Judge Lang was at the Brazil conference, and then Washington Galvão was at the Brazil conference. That was in 2018 in Victoria. And so these conferences, World Conference on Remedies to Racial and Ethnic economic inequalities, which did get shortened for our next World Conference in South Africa, which will be with the University of Western Cape, to World Conference on Remedies to Racial and Social Inequalities. So I'm very excited for that. But again, Dr. Mars has been planning these conferences, not just in the air of what can we study, right? But how can we utilize partnerships around the world with particularly departments that are Black-led, like in Brazil, the department at Espírito Santo, the Universidade Federales Espírito Santo, the department we partner with was led by a Black woman, right? A Black Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian woman. And so how can we partner with these intentionally Black, intentionally focused departments and folks to not just talk about, okay, we're going to have a great conference in Brazil. Like everybody wants to go to Brazil. Everybody wants to go to South Africa, right? But once we're there, let's deal with not just the issues that are on the ground from folks who are being impacted, but also what can we learn and what can we, give when we're there. Right. So something that really struck me about the Brazil conference was I'm a student, again, it was 2018. I had just graduated from Barnard. Right. I was having conversations with other Black students from Brazil, from around the world, about things that we all experienced when it came to racism, when it came to being a student in academia, and what we wanted to do for the world. And it was so incredibly powerful and moving, not just to have these conversations in an academic setting, but in a setting where we are next to practitioners. We are next to activists. We're not just learning about the theories. We're next to people who run the programs, right? And so that was something that I really, really enjoyed being there. And I hope to, at the University of Western Cape, which is the historically colored university in Cape Town, I'm going, again, as a student. right? I was helping coordinate the Brazil one and, help the beginning of coordinations for the South Africa one. But, this upcoming South Africa one. And that's what I hope to do. I thought you were going to ask me about Elmer, or Elmer.
Yeah, well, I was wondering if you could, I'd be happy if you told that story, but that's up to you.
Okay. Well, yes. Okay, so I'll pivot quickly, right? So, again, using that knowledge of when you're sometimes in an academic setting and you sometimes are just trying to figure out how you can give to the communities that you're a part of. This is what happened to me, right? I was at the University of Minnesota getting my master's degree in human rights, shout out to the human rights department. And I was in Professor Fry's class. The previous, just right when we were in class, right? The previous semester, I had talked to Professor Fry about a project that, we were, trying to tangle out, mainly on the surveillance of Black activists, right? So this was just something that I had noticed, something that I just kind of had in my heart, not a real project, anything, even a real thought, but just how Black activists were being surveilled, our hypervisibility online. Right now, there's a thing called doxing, right, and swatting. If folks know or don't know, it's just when your information is put out online, your home information, your family's information. When during the murder of George Floyd, after the murder of George Floyd, during the uprising, a lot of people felt unsafe in this physical space of Minneapolis. I had friends who left Minneapolis because their information was put out on the internet, right? And so we're trying to navigate this. I had been getting calls, it was like, I knew my phone number was out there, but I didn't know that I was gonna get this many types of calls. It got to a point where I made a list, and when I sent the list to my lawyer, I was like, well, this is just the list. After I realized maybe I should make a list, then I made this list of phone numbers that had called me. I was getting emails. One email I had to send to the FBI because I didn't know this guy was such a dumb, dude to put his full name, saying you're the reason why I marched on the Capitol January 6, 2021. Said, that seems dumb for you to put your full name on the email and send it from what seems like to be your personal email. So, we're dealing with these issues, and I was talking to Professor Fry, and in a couple months, maybe even just a couple weeks later, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights puts out a report that says that the Minneapolis Police Department had been strategically targeting, surveilling the Minneapolis NAACP. I was the president of Minneapolis NAACP. I wonder who was calling me. And so this was an avenue of interest of, okay, this seems like something no one ever talked about. You think you're getting Russian bots, some teenager who's disgruntled. You don't think you're getting calls from your local police department. You don't think, you get these messages. They found that the police department had created essentially like blackface type Facebook pages where they were masquerading as Black community members and sending harassing emails, messages. And, you don't think that that's actually your local police department. When you're weekly having meetings with the chief of the police department, and you weekly have conversations on the agenda about how to change the police department, and then you go home and you get messages from the local police department, allegedly. That all happened. And so we had this conversation of what's happening with activists. What are human rights defenders? And then that's also something that the University of Minnesota Human Rights Department had done a project on previously, was networks for justice for human rights defenders, of how they didn't feel protected or did, trying to find these areas of safety. So we wanted to go dive deep into that. And one of the conversations we started having was with Tashira Garraway from Families Supporting Families Against Police Violence. And she started talking about how the families, after they've lost loved ones, were being essentially harassed by police departments. And sometimes the very person that murdered their loved one would show up at the rally. They would see them outside their door, their home. You know, there's these stories of almost every family who had a murdered loved one by the police department of continued interaction once they spoke up about the police violence. So we sent that to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and we sent that testimony, and they grabbed on, right? They said, we want you to go deeper on this section. So we had Amelia Schindelar, who is the principal investigator for a research, and we continued to gather this testimony. And then at the same time, we found out that the expert mechanism of law enforcement and racism was going to do a country visit to the US. And we said, this is who they need to listen to. Let's talk about the full extent of police conduct. You want to know what happens afterward. You want to know what the full extent of the misconduct is. You keep on asking why the police never change. Well, the police are still acting out there, right? And so we got a petition it went like viral on TikTok, which is like the great thing about social media. Like you can get a lot of signatures on social media and doing this work. Got, I think it was like 1,400 signatures from folks, and we sent that to the expert mechanism. Only to find out they weren't even trying to come to Minnesota. They were compelled once they saw the petition, once they saw Ilhan Omar's letter, once they saw, all of these folks and community organizations were calling them here. This is where George Floyd was murdered. This is where an international, movement, uprising started. If you don't come here, then you're missing the point. So they came, and we had the event, the testimony town hall at the Urban League in Minneapolis, and not only were families there, but also children adults but when they were children, they were incarcerated in adult facilities, and they were incarcerated in solitary confinement in adult facilities. And so those two big issues were brought up at the town hall testimony hearing. And when I tell you how emotional and moving it was to be in that space of just truth-telling. And of course, a lot went into it. And what I find so amazing is that every single person who came had a policy recommendation. These aren't just folks who are traumatized and impacted. These are folks who come and saying, this is what I want you to do. This is where the UN can push Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, can push them to make better their obligations to us on a human rights framework. So every single person came with a policy recommendation. And so I was really proud when the expert mechanism published the report. Some of their recommendations were word for word what the families had put up. And you can't imagine that in any other way. The word for word, what the recommendations were printed into the UN recommendations. And so I got to be the one who went back to the family meeting, 9 p.m., right? Like, I'm tired, after everyone had gotten off of their job, and to tell them, word for word, what your recommendation, what you brought up is in this UN's report. And you can use it however you want. But just know that your recommendation is validated not just by you and your lived experience, which will always be the base of validation, but also by the UN and the expert mechanism.
Nice story. Thank you for telling it. Emily, you are welcome to bring your own stories into this, but I wanted to talk about the role of the CVT in the post 9/11 era of what were euphemistically called enhanced interrogations by the U.S. government, where we who we're so proud of all of our work in creating a convention against torture and supporting the Center for Victims of Torture, being a role model, and all of a sudden American agents were carrying out torture in Guantanamo and Bagram and various other places, and we were having to, it felt like we were having to fight the fight all the way over again. Maybe talk about what the CVT's response to that was, and how it shifted your advocacy work. And then just like one of the really unique things about the Center for Victims of Torture, even as regards all centers around the world, is the advocacy function, right? So if you go to the treatment center in Germany or in Denmark, they do great treatment and rehabilitation for the victims, but they don't get involved in this work of advocacy. So I'm just using that as an example of the kind of advocacy work and what it meant.
Thanks. I should be clear, I did not work for CVT at this time, but I did have a wonderful conversation for folks in the room with Pete Droz. Probably a lot of you know him. He just retired from CVT after 35 years. And so he had a lot of great stories about that time that I'm excited to share. So I think, in that post 9/11 world that we were in, actually, a group of organizations came together to form the Campaign to Ban Torture. And that was really formed in part, I'm going to call out Nancy Pearson again, and this group came together and utilized the New Tactics in Human Rights Strategic Effectiveness Method to kind of come up with the framework for what would become the Campaign to Ban Torture. And one of the elements of that advocacy was around getting, influential people to speak out against what the United States was doing. And in particular, people, politicians, religious leaders, and folks in the military, right? And so CVT in this coalition, one of our tasks, as I understand it, was to sign up the military folks. And we were able to do that really meaningfully based on a relationship that we had with Alberto Mora, who is the former general counsel for the Navy. And he was really influential in helping CVT and encouraging what ended up being 3 former secretaries of state, 3 former secretaries of defense, and 4 former chairmen, actually, let's be real, of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to sign on to the campaign and really speak out prominently. I think this is an interesting story, 1, because it's cool that we got all those folks to sign up, but 2, because I think it actually illustrates some of the friction within the anti-torture movement. So a larger organization that shall remain nameless from another part of the country was really unhappy that CVT was doing this. Like, they were genuinely upset that we were inserting ourselves into this space in this way, and felt, I think, well, I can't speak for them, but I think the impression they gave felt sort of that we should not be at the adult table. Right, like we should be, do your thing here, do your treatment thing, leave the actual work, advocacy work to us. And we didn't do that. But I think it's just I think it's just also an interesting illustration of, organizations you would think would be fully aligned and seamlessly work together don't always. and that is unfortunate. And so it's actually one of the outcomes of part of that, at least in Pete's telling, is so we started giving out an annual award called the Eclipse Award, which we give to someone who's really, advanced the movement in a significant way. And one of the reasons we started doing it in Washington, D.C., was so that people in DC would see, oh, CVT, like, we see you. You're like, yeah, you're based in the Midwest, but we see you in DC. So I just think it's like an interesting illustration of it doesn't always go perfectly.
Yeah. And also an interesting illustration of Minnesota. Why
Exactly.
those people in Minnesota?
Well,
Yeah.
right. So the fact that flyover country can do this kind of stuff and get traction beyond our borders is really interesting. And you have to punch above your weight, to use a kind of stupid analogy, but you know, in order to get people to say, oh, you know something about this?
Like you can be, I think that's what is always so interesting to me. Like you can be truly the best in the field at something, but if, you know, the certain cadre of people don't know who you are, it doesn't really matter. It just feels like it's really hard to push, you know, constantly be pushing against that. And you are, yeah, it does feel like constantly people are looking at us like we're punching above our weight.
I have an anecdote from years working with the Midwest Coalition for Human Rights that some of you are involved in. We just decided that human rights was practiced differently in the Midwest. And Nancy Arneson, I'm sure, was part of this, getting this started. And we in the Bosnia-Wash corridor in California, they had big organizations, but we typically had smaller organizations and centers, and you know, Minnesota always punched above its weight, and Chicago. But the rest, we had like a 7-state area where we would have an individual or two or somebody who worked with meatpacking workers' rights or whatever. And we started meeting quarterly, and we would meet in Chicago. People would fly in for a day. We'd spend a day. We'd come up with the issues that were of concern to us in our community. So we worked on torture, and Chicago police torture is part of this exhibition upstairs. We worked on detention of immigrants. I'm trying to think. Prison, yeah. Oh yeah, solitary confinement in prisons. So anyway, we would work together. Well, one year, there was a new organization from the East Coast, a new network that was being funded by big funders. And they decided Chicago, you know, they needed to come out to Chicago, and they came out, and they were going to come teach us when we had the Midwest Coalition about human rights and how you use human rights mechanisms. And it was unbelievable. It was like the most amazing couple hours where people just sat there like shaking their heads. They sent out experts to tell us how to use human rights mechanisms, right? So, you know, yeah, and it goes to, there's a circle here, which is why we're telling these stories here, is that you do have to get your stories out, and you do have to, you do have to keep at it and say, yeah, we've got a few experts of our own around here.
I would say that the University of Minnesota website, right, Human Rights Department, Human Rights website, right, that I would say is the difference, though. You know, it's an exception in a lot of ways. So before the UN even got a website, good one, talking about, you know, the UN Human Rights Declaration, all the treaties, things like that, you had to go to the University of Minnesota website to do it, to look at the treaties, things like that. And so wherever I go, I will say that when I say I come from the University of Minnesota Human Rights Department, I'm at the University of Miami now. That is one of the things, the first things that they said to me. They said, oh, well, we had to go to the University of Minnesota website before we could even go to the UN website, which, you know, still sometimes you go to the UN website, some pages, they move it around. But it's good, it's good.
We should give credit where credit is due here. This is the Human Rights Center of the law school, and this was Professor David Weisbrod's brainchild. And he raised the money to create something called the Human Rights Library. It was an online human rights library that had every treaty and every case, and he employed students and volunteers and to do this work. And what people love who were doing research is they had the correct citations for every case. The top of each case, all you had to do was cut and paste and put it in your article. But more importantly, there was nowhere else to go. And so you are absolutely right. I'm sure we have all had this experience when we travel internationally that people say, oh, the Minnesota Human Rights Library. So.
And another version of this is when the Advocates for Human Rights first got engaged with Romania, the NGOs in Romania, to explore whether the government was meeting its obligations that would have required them to protect women from, violence that was not interrupted by the state in any way, shape, or form. And as soon as that happened, of course, the women's NGOs and the rest of the area were like, hey, wait a minute, you got to come over and look at our government and look at our practices and look at the incidents of violence against women and then all of a sudden it was like, it was the thing. And other big, huge human rights organizations weren't doing that kind of thing. And that was a problem.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. In some respects, I think Minnesota is more recognized for its contribution to the human rights movement outside of the United States. Like, you go to different places and there's like if you go to Kosovo and you say you're from Minnesota, everyone's like, oh yeah, obviously, of course you are. Yeah, everyone here, basically everyone here is from Minnesota. So many Minnesotans have been engaged in work in Kosovo, and I think it's fascinating because one of the ways that we see this sort of manifest itself today in our work is we will encounter situations where organizations or unofficial groups will be going to a donor and saying to the donor, we want CVT to come help us. And the donor is going, who is that? What? We had this other, organization that probably wasn't Midwest based in mind. And so it's just an interesting, I think, thing to reflect on that made me think of that. And when I wasn't working for CVT, 1,000 years ago, my first job, the first country I visited was Jordan. And we were meeting with an organization that was focused on SGBV. And I said, oh, I'm from Minnesota. And they're like, oh, the Duluth model? What? Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. I was just saying that I happened to go on a trip to Jordan and mentioned I was from Minnesota, and this group of activists working in SGBV immediately said the Duluth model. And I thought that was really amazing.
Oh my God. That's exactly right. One of my favorite anecdotes, I've been doing oral histories as part of this project, and one of my favorite anecdotes that Robin told in her oral history was in Beijing, I think, where Delina Fico is holding the Romania report. She says, you see this report? She said, see where it says Romania? I want it to say Albania. Get it? And Robin is like, yeah, I get it. And so, it was like, this huge demand. And so, we rely on it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that goes to another thing, though, is how we are perceived internationally for our human rights work, but then bringing it home, right? And our human rights obligations that are still here, I think is something that, I would encourage everyone, who does work abroad to also think about how the U.S. hasn't ratified a lot of these treaties that we be talking about other countries, to hold them obligated for. The U.S., doesn't really fully believe in a positive obligation the same way in the human rights framework. They feel like, we have no obligation to stop an individual from being harmed. interesting. That's not what I read in the Constitution, but, I'm not a white man from 1790, so, my interpretations could be off. And so it's one of those things where I really do feel like while we're doing amazing, fantastic work abroad, that the work starts here and the work continues here because there's still issues and great disparities here. And, I think there's a way to do both, right? To see us in this global network, but also not to forget what's going on at home.
I think that's a super important point, and I think when it makes me think of the New Tactics in Human Rights program the work really started outside of the U.S. and engaging with activists in other countries to advance that work. And then as we went along, the program's going to be 25 years old next year, started to think more about, okay, we've done a lot of great, and we continue to do a lot of great work outside of the U.S., but what about inside the U.S.? And the number of people who would say to us, well, you're going to have to change your name. And I said, why? And they said, well, Americans don't understand human rights or that they're victims of them. And I was like, well, maybe that's a reason to keep the name then, so we can help people. But I think there is this general sense that human rights violations happen other places. That's what we hear about on the news. They don't happen in this country. And of course they do all the time. And we didn't change our name. And, I think that was for the good. But I do think it's just this interesting, that American exceptionalism sense that is just so false.
Loretta, any last thoughts?
Well, this is so depressing.
No, uplifting last thoughts. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it's true. I have to confess that many years ago, I kind of poo-pooed the notion of trying to employ human rights principles to advance violence against women agendas because everybody was like, what?
Yeah.
And, if you're going to use the law and there's no law that binds anybody because nobody agrees to anything, that's kind of a problem. But so it was kind of fun to go overseas where people would go, oh, yeah, you're right. We got to comply with these human rights principles. I do want to say one thing. This is kind of Debbie Downer, but in my assessment, violence against women in intimate relationships is still extremely problematic, and despite all the changes that we have made, and they are many, this remains an extremely entrapping condition for many women and children. And what's been interesting and alarming is the increase, and I know this because I'm old enough. When I started practicing law in 1977, if you were being beat up by your husband, let's say, and you could get a lawyer and file for divorce, and you had children, the chances were pretty decent that you would be given custody of your children. And reality was that basically the two parties would split up, and the abuser husband in this hypothetical would find another woman and then do the same thing to that in that relationship. But that man would be no longer involved in his children's lives for most purposes. That was pretty much what the world looked like, for better or for ill. And now, that same woman is going to likely be compelled to have her children spend half of their time in the physical custody unsupervised by that person who has not changed a single thing about the way he thinks about his right to control through violence his family members. And this is a very sad state of affairs, that we have lost ground dramatically in the family court system, even where other changes have been made. There's shelters available now. There's all kinds of things that are better. And this is a This is a terrible embarrassment. And now we're seeing, speaking of global reach, that same thing starting to happen all over the globe, where the movement to undercut women's ability to get out of a relationship with their children is moving ahead. So they're picking up all kinds of stuff we're doing here, and they're starting it elsewhere. And there is no real appetite, from what I can see, in that is holding the line on this for stopping this baloney from getting worse and worse all the time. And now, instead of being, anyway, it's a bad thing. And there was some really good work going on in Hennepin County until the funding ended to try to make the court system respond really well to this kind of thing. And this is another example of judicial officers and other people from Hennepin County were being brought all over the United States to come and talk about what was going on there, how to take account better for these kinds of realities in the home where kids are. Anyway, there's got to be a lot more.
Well, we're at time, so I'm going to try to spin that really hard story. No, not really. I think that we all know that there's, we haven't fixed it, right? We haven't fixed it. There's a lot more work to be done. And obviously it is our great hope that this kind of collection and this kind of exhibit does what we're doing right now, which is to stimulate discussion with each other about what has worked, what hasn't worked, what work is yet to be done, and sharing stories intergenerationally about things that made a difference, and really inspiring new leadership to take change, to make change on these issues, and make progress where we haven't been able to. So Loretta, Angela Rose, and Emily, I am so, did I say that right? I am so honored to have been able to chair this panel with each of you. I respect your work so much, and thank you for kicking this exhibition off to a great start. Thank you.